it was just an interesting idea, of a guy who has to wear this big, bulky armor as he did at first.
But you still have to build in that weakness. What is his weakness? Wait a minute. Why is this thing on his chest? Oh, wait, he almost died.
He's this very fragile guy in a certain way, but he's also like one of the richest guys in the world, a great inventor and so forth.
He's a cool exec with a heart of steel. What else is there?
Iron Man was always an evolving look.
It was interesting to see the story evolve because that first outfit that Iron Man had looked like a hot water tank.
Imagine crafting your own wall art. Maybe it's a passion that fascinates you. Or maybe it's the promise of an immersive creative experience like no other. A piece of iconic art you can build for yourself. Relax and reconnect with your creative side. We've created unique soundtracks, specially curated around the world of art, music, and movies. And in this soundtrack, we're going to look into the world of Marvel Comics in general and the Iron Man character in particular. We'll hear from experts and editors with a deep knowledge of superheroes and the way the Marvel Universe was created, before taking a deep dive into Iron Man and his many armors through time.
I almost would say my heart belongs to the water tank.
I'm Andrea Collins. Welcome to Lego Art. Let's meet our guests and hear when and how their passion for comic books got started. Our first guest is comic book collector and Marvel expert Maggie Thompson.
My name is Maggie Thompson. I'm 77 years old, and I have spent about 72 years of that collecting comic books.
Wow.
The deal with the comic book in the 1940s was that if you wanted it, you should buy it then, and if you wanted to read it the next month, you'd better have kept it and kept it in good condition because you couldn't go to the library to reread it. And thus did collecting begin for me. I discovered that I actually have a comic book I bought when I was 4 years old.
Wow.
I have that comic book.
As far as comics, my first comics was, I think I was 4.
Another big Marvel expert, Alex Grand, started with comics at around the same age.
And I liked how you could see the words. The picture showed you who's saying it. So it felt like I was reading a movie. And that really captured my attention. Then newsstand comics from like 7-Eleven in the 80s. And those were generally were Marvel comics like Power Man and Iron Fist. And then what really captured my attention was like Thor and Iron Man. And then by 1988, I was a 10-year-old and I was basically rocking and rolling as a Marvel fan.
Here's the former editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, Roy Thomas.
My first memories of comic books, they sort of fade in, really. Evidently, I spotted some comics, probably Batman and Superman kind of stuff, on a drugstore shelf when I was about 4 and a few months old, something like that, 4 years old anyway, maybe even a little earlier. Although my, parents didn't have much money, this was like the tail end of the Depression, and my dad had just a shoe factory job and all that. But they scraped together a dime to get me a comic, and that was kind of the start of it. My mother would read them to me, for the first 6 months or a year, but I very quickly was so intrigued, wanting to learn what the stories were that I learned a lot of reading, so that I had a fairly good reading vocabulary by the time I entered the first grade. And it wasn't all from comics, or else I'd have only known, capital letters. But between that and some children's books and things like that, I kind of got a jump on things, I think.
I'm seeing a trend here. If you become a Marvel fan, you start when you're 4. Let's hear if it's the same for the current Marvel editor, Tom Brevoort.
My first memories of reading Marvel comics are all awful. And so my earliest Marvel memories would have been about watching the 1967 Spider-Man cartoon, which, ran in syndication for years in the New York area in the afternoon. And as a really young kid of 3 years old or whatever I was, I didn't understand Spider-Man. I didn't understand the web shooters. There'd be these long sequences in the show where Spider-Man would swing across the city. And I didn't understand how the web shooter worked. So to my 3-year-old mind, Spider-Man had strung all these ropes up all across the city like Tarzan and was swinging from one to the other that he'd put there previously. I didn't understand. I didn't get it. I started reading comics in 1973. I was about 6 years old. I started with the DC books of the period, and I read a couple of Marvel books during that era. And almost every Marvel book I picked up turned out to be a bad choice for one reason or another.
We'll get back to Tom Brevoort a bit later on in the soundtrack to hear if he ever got hooked on the Marvel Universe. Spoiler, he did. He even found out how the web shooter works. Let's go back to Maggie Thompson. She's a respected Marvel expert and a longtime editor of the iconic industry publication Comics Buyer's Guide. Together with her late husband, Don Thompson, they built a collection of comic books, wrote a ton of articles, and worked together on their passion for comics.
We started the first amateur magazine devoted to comic art as opposed to superheroes, and it was called Comic Art. And we worked on that, and eventually the hobby turned into a job, and here I am later.
Wow. So between the two of you and your husband, how big is your comic book collection at your house?
I literally have no idea right now. I've been trying to weed the duplicates out, but more than 100,000.
Oh my gosh.
Well, you can't write an article about comic books if you don't have the comic books to refer to. So I didn't collect them because they were valuable. I collected them because I needed a panel to put in an article that I wrote, or just for relaxation too. There's also revisiting the nostalgia of childhood.
Now, if we look at people who created comics, it was a very male-dominated world. What would you say about that? Because you are a female comic fan. You've definitely, you're a big name in comics. So what's your take on that?
My mother, who was fascinated by comic books, went to a comics convention at one point and discovered that basically the entirety of the female population there was only there because of the boys they were with. She went up to each of these females and said, "Why are you here? And why did you not collect comics by yourself?" So this was in the 1970s. And the response she got was that it was not a socially acceptable place. Plus, the girls did not have the disposable income that the guys had. Chances were if the girls got an allowance or they got money from babysitting or whatever, they were expected to provide their own fashion, their own hair care, their own makeup. The guys, they had a ball and a bat and they could go out and their parents basically handed them the rest of their entertainment money to dispose of it however they chose. And one of the ways they chose was comic books.
But you always stuck with it.
Well, because we like the art form. My husband and I like the art form. So the magazine that we created, Comic Art, not only dealt with comic books, but also comic strips, magazine cartoons, animated cartoons, and so forth. And then we had kids of our own, and Don, for example, would read to my daughter Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and so forth, because she could look over his shoulder at the pictures as I had looked over Mom's shoulder when she read me comic books before I could read. When he was reading the stories to Valerie, he made Sue Storm the brains of the Fantastic Four. So instead of Mr. Fantastic saying, "Okay, Sue, stand over there," she'd say, "Okay, Reed, I'm going to stand over here while you do this and that and the other." So she thought Sue was the head of the Fantastic Four. And I didn't know he had done that. And I said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "I didn't want my daughter to grow up thinking that all a girl could do was hide."
Oh, I love that.
Me too.
We're now joined by Alex Grand. He has a bachelor's in visual arts, is a frequent Comic-Con panelist, motion comics animator, and host of Comic Book Historians podcast. So how does one become a comic book historian?
There isn't really classes for that, right? I think there's comic book fans and there's comic book collectors. Then there's comic book historians that they go back and do some interviews, try to find out what happened, kind of read in between the lines a bit, look at the old indices of the comics, look at the old companies, try to do as much background research into the people that made the comics, especially, as well as the historical context of the time of what was going on in the 60s, what was going on in the 50s, what was going on in the 70s. These are all very different cultural vibes, and how do they manifest into that commercial artistic product that we're reading? Then there's probably one level above comic book historian called comic book archaeologist, and they'll find like the old comics from like the 1800s, you know, and try to get them into a museum, right? And that's kind of a different branch. And the higher you go, the more esoteric. But I think comic book historians, they still got their finger on the pulse of the fun side of pop culture, and also like to look at the cause and effect of why certain things came out a certain way.
So there were comic books as far back as the 1800s. The first modern comic book as we would recognize it was published in 1935 and called New Fun. That was the origins of the DC comics that also introduced Superman in 39. But then came the Marvel Revolution in the 60s.
They call it the Marvel Revolution, where people like Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, Jack Kirby created the Marvel characters. And I think the reason why those are important is because they came at a time in the 60s when people were ready for new stuff, and they were trying to be more relevant, you know, trying to have more mundane concerns, but also like Lego pieces. The characters were made by the same people within the same 10 years, so they all fit really naturally together within the real New York City. As opposed to a lot of other comic book companies where one person made another character in vacuum, then a whole nother person made another character in vacuum, and these pieces don't fit as well. So I think kind of like Lego, Marvel Comics characters from the 60s, which are all those characters in the movies now, they fit naturally together. Their personalities mesh, even though they're different personalities, they fit better. It feels more natural.
And that might be one of the reasons why we're so fascinated by the Marvel Universe. The characters appear to fit almost seamlessly together. According to Maggie Thompson, merchandising is another reason.
If Stan Lee had sat down with Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and they'd told these wonderful stories and just a bunch of kids ever saw them, we wouldn't be fascinated today. But what happened was, with making toys available and costumes tie into imagination. So it's Halloween, and if you're 5 years old, you can wear a superhero costume and people will know who you are. That's a thrill.
I think it's interesting to try to imagine what would it be if there were actual superheroes that lived in our time. It would be fun to understand that and try to think that these characters that have these powers, they could literally do anything they want. But instead, they've come upon some internal code where they feel like they want to make the world a better place. And if we had these powers, maybe we would also be better people. And so then we strive to be better people in our normal lives.
A man named Harvey Pekar once said, "In comic art, there's no limit to how good the pictures can be, and there's no limit to how good the words can be." So if you put the best words and the best pictures together, you have entertainment that's not like anything else.
It's also just the flashy fighting. I think as far as a superhero genre, there's different genres like crime and romance. They all give different things. I think in the superhero genre, it's kind of like part of it is like watching a wrestling match where you see this flashy, strong person here and a flashy, strong person there fighting. But Marvel gives that more of an internal meaning, as far as they throw in a little bit of romance, they throw in a little bit of sci-fi, they throw a little bit of crime, they throw other genres into the superhero genre to make it a mixed, fun, multi-layered message.
That was Maggie Thompson and Alex Grand's take on why we're so fascinated by the Marvel Universe. Let's explore this a bit more with two people who were on the inside. Current editor Tom Brevoort and the man who became Stan Lee's first successor as Marvel's editor-in-chief in '72, Roy Thomas.
I don't know what made Marvel, so special. It was just one of those ideas that it was just a slight mutation in what comics had been. They'd always been the superheroes, and they'd always had some kind of little personal problems. But they were minor things like Superman trying to protect his secret identity from Lois Lane. Well, that's not the kind of problem most of us usually have, But Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four, they had problems that resonated with people. Or you had a guy who's worried that he's trying to do the right thing, but at the same time, if his aging aunt finds out that he's this superhero and putting himself in danger all the time, she's going to have a heart attack and die, and sometimes it was just that he'd break an arm or he'd have a cold or something.
And here's the current Marvel editor, Tom Brevoort.
People, first of all, like stories. It's just there's something about the way human beings are wired. We like stories, and we tend to like our stories to have easily delineatable good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains, or protagonists and antagonists, people that you empathize with and are rooting for and are following along and learning something about the human condition while you do it. Any superhero story is about larger-than-life characters who often can do things that are impossible at the outset. But that's really no different in its way than almost any action-adventure movie. Nobody can really do what Indiana Jones does. The audience, we just like larger-than-life heroes. We like people who stand for something. We like to experience the vicarious thrills and danger and excitement. We like being powerful. We like relating to characters that foul things up and muddle their way through and learn how to do it better. And all of these are things that we try to imbue the various Marvel characters and Marvel stories with.
The thing with the Marvel things in the early days was I think that you just didn't know what was going to come next. I mean, the Fantastic Four would be going along just fine. Then all of a sudden there'd be a story in which they lose all their money and they get kicked out of their building,
Yeah.
Or Spider-Man, would, he'd lose one girlfriend, get another one. One of them even, very spectacularly died, in the story. And the writer of that story got hate mail and was afraid to go to comic conventions for several years because he'd always get attacked by the fans. But obviously people took these things, very seriously. It's not that they believed them. They, most of the people they're not, crazy enough or immature enough to believe they're real, but they get an investment in them. When you read a character every month or you read a bunch of characters every month, you really get invested with the character and with the storyline. And you get upset if it goes a direction that you really hate,
I think it's about time we got to know a bit more about the two gentlemen, Tom Brevoort and Roy Thomas, that you just heard. Roy is one of the founders of comics fandom and among the first of its ranks to turn pro. When Marvel was getting kickstarted in 1961 and carrying on through the mid-60s, Stan Lee was really the only one doing the plots. So he needed someone also to be able to think like him, so the universe could expand and be pushed. And Roy was perfect for that role because he came in as a huge fan. Let's get Alex and Maggie to help me introduce Roy.
Roy Thomas was really important in that he was able to then take what Stan and company were doing and then expand and push and make it fresh, and also start appealing to the new audiences that were starting to kind of develop in the later 60s and in the 70s that kind of wanted to take it into a slightly more mature fashion.
Roy came up about the same time we did in terms of being a fan, a published fan. So Don and I created an amateur magazine called Comic Art. And Roy Thomas worked with a college professor named Jerry Bales, and they put out their own fanzine, and it was called Alter Ego. That, by the way, is continuing today with Roy Thomas as the editor. So Roy went from fan to professional and back to professional fan. I don't know all the things he's doing, but it's his career is a fascinating arc.
So he was perfect because he could bring in comic history perspective, a comic fan's perspective, but he was also a great writer. He knew what Stan was looking for because he loved what Stan was doing so much that he was able to then kind of unload some of the work off Stan.
He was one of the first to go to New York City as a fan who wanted to work in the industry and become a professional. And he passed the Stan Lee test. And my guess is he can speak to that himself.
So, Roy, you left your native Missouri to go to New York City in '65 at the age of just 24?
I guess it was fairly young then, but as one professional told me, he says, you're an old man getting into the field. He said, we were all teenagers. In my case, since 1961, when I was 20, I had been involved in the world in a way, which was the comic book fanzine. I had never quit reading comics. A lot of people, I guess, a lot of guys, girls, give them up when they reach puberty or they're 10 or 12 or 14 or something like that. I never did that. So I kept doing this fanzine about comics, mostly about the return of the superhero comics, and then about the history of the old ones from the 40s and the 50s, that kind of thing. And I exchanged letters with a few editors at DC and with Stan Lee, who was the one editor really at Marvel, maybe one or two other people. And then one day, as I was when I was teaching my fourth year of teaching high school near St. Louis in Missouri, I received a letter from the man who edited the 7 Superman titles for DC. You know, there was Superman, Superboy, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, a couple of others, one with Superman and Batman together, and offered me a job based on the fact that he'd seen the fanzine writing I'd done and the letters I'd written. And he offered me a job as his assistant editor or editorial assistant, whatever it was. So I moved to New York in late June of 1965. But unfortunately, after a week or two, I discovered that I just couldn't get along with the editor. He had a reputation, well-deserved, for being kind of a sadist, and I wasn't as good as his previous assistant at putting up with that kind of behavior. So I didn't know exactly what to do except tough it out, except that I wanted to meet Stan Lee because I felt he was writing, the best comics that were going at the time, and I wanted to meet him. And I didn't ever meet him, but over the phone, he ended up having me come by later and take this sort of writing test, writing a few pages of dialogue to go with pictures of an already existent Fantastic Four story. After I did that, I got a call while I was working at DC and was asked to come over and meet him on my lunch hour. So I sneaked over, and about 15 minutes after we met, he offered me a job.
He offered you a job pretty much on the spot then? Yeah,
I'd never met him before. We'd exchanged 1 or 2 letters. That was about it, really. Pretty soon I was dialoguing a couple of Doctor Strange stories and an Iron Man, and finally I graduated to my first regular series, which wasn't quite a superhero comic. It was Sergeant Fury. And from then on, it went on to the X-Men and Avengers and other things.
Wow.
It's just like, there's that old line in Uncle Tom's Cabin, I think, about how, Topsy, the character in there, says she just growed. And that's sort of what my job did. It just growed.
What was it like working with Stan Lee? What was he like to work with?
Well, mostly it was good. Like anybody else, sometimes he could get in a temper, but then, of course, I probably deserved it sometime. But I would say 90+% of the time we got on quite well. I admired the work he was doing and the fact that he seemed to know what he was doing, and ride herd over some very good artists, especially Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. But gradually he was able to even sell comics with lesser artists and teach them how to draw the kind of comics he was looking for, which mainly meant that they were exciting. And it kind of left DC in the dust over the next few years.
Wow. Not
that they didn't have some good books and some very talented people, but Marvel just kind of, gradually kept gaining on them in terms of sales.
In 72, you became Stan Lee's first successor as Marvel's editor-in-chief. How did that happen? And what was that like to find out that you were stepping into those big shoes?
Well, it was a little more gradual than that, but it was really totally unexpected. I never really have been a guy who thinks ahead a lot. Some people have their 5-year and 10-year plans. Where do you want to be in 5 years? I could never really think that far ahead. I knew I wanted to get out of teaching, but that was about it. Once I was in comics, I just never thought beyond the idea he was going to stay the editor and I'd stay the associate editor, which was my title by then. And then one day, and I had no preparation for this, really, I found out that Stan had used his clout with the conglomerate that had purchased us a few years earlier to say that he was either leaving or he wanted to become the publisher and president of the comic company part himself of Marvel Comics.
Let's hear from the current Marvel editor, Tom Brevoort. And he's actually been with them for more than 30 years now. How'd that happen? As you might remember from the beginning of the soundtrack, he wasn't that big of a Marvel fan when he was a kid.
I actively didn't like them. I was a Marvel naysayer until probably until around I was, maybe 10 years old. We had a drugstore chain in my area. And in the drugstore during the 70s, they had what in my memory is a really huge wire bin filled with comics. And the comics were all a couple of months old. They weren't fresh and new off the racks. They were a couple of months, older than that. And I went digging through that bin, and I pulled up 3 consecutive issues of Fantastic Four, which featured the Human Torch. They were 177, 178, 179, and I took them back to my house, and I stretched out in my living room, with my feet under the living room coffee table, and I read those 3 comics, and that was sort of my entry into the Marvel Universe.
There you go. So you did a full reversal.
Yes.
So how did you end up working at Marvel in 89?
Well, I was an illustration major at the University of Delaware. And I was always interested in comics. I wanted to do comics, when I was a kid, even, during the times I was talking about earlier, I would draw my own comics and, copy things out of the books and make up my own characters and, all of that stuff. I sort of always had an interest in the medium and the field and so forth. And that was something that I was interested in doing. So going to the University of Delaware for illustration in their arts program, you had to go and serve an internship, somewhere at some organization related in some way to the field. So I sent out letters of inquiry. And I didn't just send it to Marvel. I sent it to every comic book publisher that there was in those days. And Marvel was the only one that wrote back to me. So I got a response. And I went up and, did an interview on the premises in Manhattan. And then I was a Marvel intern for the summer of 1989. I interned 5 days a week. And that was my entree into everything.
Wow.
And by December of that year, I'd been hired on as an assistant editor, and I've been around ever since.
Alex Grand and Maggie Thompson say that Tom Brevoort was, and continues to be, very important for Marvel Comics.
Tom's fantastic. He's got a great sense of humor. He connects with the fans. So, for example, in addition to his usual work, he's doing things on Twitter where he's posting, look at this rare Marvel item. Isn't this just the best thing in the world? He's doing what Stan did in terms of connecting with the reader and making each reader feel he or she is a friend of Tom's.
I think one thing that's really specifically important about Tom Brevoort is he's one of the newer Marvel people that still cares about the older Marvel stuff. I think that's really important in that he has his own comic history blog. He really looks back at the old stuff, like from the 60s and 50s, and tries to, even now, still sort it out. He's made a huge impression on keeping Marvel great, right? And then he is also able to look at the old stuff. So he's a great balance of new and old, and I think that's really special about Tom Brevoort.
Tom also has the most misspelled name in comics, I would guess. We did a newspaper about comics for years, and I don't think I ever had to correct anyone's spelling more often than to the misspelling of Tom's last name.
In case you're wondering, it's spelled Brevoort. Coming up, all of our 4 guests have met Stan Lee. One of them was actually one of the last people to see him alive. We're going to hear more about that a little bit later on and hopefully learn a lot more about this legendary man. We're also going to introduce 2 more names into the discussion, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, and discover just how important they were in the creation of the Marvel Universe at the time. We're going to dive much more into the Iron Man character. And then we're joined by the 2 Lego designers who created the Lego art of Iron Man.
I was actually super excited, to be honest. I don't very often geek out, but with this product, I definitely did.
Hear just how much Lego designer Christopher Stamp geeked out and about the process of creating the Lego art pictures of Iron Man from both him and his colleague Kitt Kossmann later on. But now let's explore what actually makes a good superhero. Here's Roy Thomas.
Well, if I really knew that, I could invent a new one and make a lot of money in my old age here. You never really know. You try one out, and the public just decides if they like them or not. But I think the best way is just to think it through, make sure that he's different from other characters, so that when you look at that character, you don't think, oh, this is just the same guy with another mask or another secret identity. The best characters always brought something new. I mean, Superman was something new under the sun. There was never been anything quite like him before. Batman, sure, he was a little like Zorro, but he was a modern day guy. He didn't have any powers like Superman, but he had a mask and so forth. Spider-Man was weird because he had these spider powers, which were kind of awkward, and because he was a kid that had them. The Thing, who was my favorite Marvel character, was just an ordinary Joe, a test pilot, kind of gruff, who suddenly found himself trapped in this monstrous body that he couldn't get out of, while the Hulk would bounce back and forth between being the Hulk and being this scientist, and each of them hated the other one,
The challenge with creating a superhero is in building in their weaknesses and challenges. So if your primary audience is kids, you tap into their concerns. So the kid might be isolated and weak, but what if your character is isolated and strong? And then that's a combination of wish fulfillment and imagination challenge. What happens next to Peter Parker after he's bitten by a radioactive spider, but he has to watch out for his aunt, etc.?
I think the best superheroes are the ones that they have internal problems, but they try to overcome them.
Alex agrees with Maggie.
There are certain ones that they're perfect. They kind of fall flat with me personally as a reader. I think the ones that are internally driven by guilt or some other feelings, but then they strive to get above that and beyond that.
Tom Brevoort mentions the importance of having a good story.
There's something about the way human beings are wired. We like stories, and we tend to like our stories to have easily delineatable good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains, or protagonists and antagonists, people that you empathize with and are rooting for and are following along in terms of the journey they are on and learning something about the human condition while you do it.
So you come up with these characters. Each one's got to have something new and something different. I made up a character based somewhat on an old character called The Vision. And basically, Stan had told me that he'd like me to make up a character who was an android. He didn't tell me why. Why don't you put somebody in the Avengers who's an android? That was the end of my instruction, And I found that was interesting because then you had this guy who was a hero, but he was also trying to deal with the idea of being human.
It's the enemies and the challenges, because otherwise it's going to be boring. If you just had, the guy gets up in the day and everything's peachy and he has a wonderful breakfast and he goes out and maybe stops a burglary over here and then gets back to eating dinner, that's not much. But if you say, but he's got to protect X from Y and you've got to make Y interesting too, that begins to feed into a fully fleshed universe.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's interesting. Also, there has to be probably some set limitations. I think just if they can just move a whole planet, there's probably not much that can challenge them. And I think then that becomes a comic to kind of skip over. If they have limits and then they have to figure out ways to fight people that are stronger and try to figure it out, I think that also makes for a good superhero that can make that relatable to a reader. I think relatability is probably the number one factor, though.
Let's hear about one of the characters Roy Thomas created.
One of the most minor things I ever did became one of Marvel's biggest characters. And I called the writer, Len Wein, in, and I said, we got all these Canadian readers. 5-10% of our readers probably are Canadian. And we've never had, and nobody else that I know of, outside of Canada itself at one time, ever had a Canadian superhero in an American comic books. So I wanted an animal that lived in Canada, and I thought, I knew about animals, so I thought Wolverine. That sounded kind of fierce. And Wolverine's an animal that's very small, so I wanted him to be short, and he's very bad-tempered because they'll attack things 5 or 10 times their own size. And I just gave that to the writer and the art director and so forth. And out of this, this Wolverine concept I had came a character that ended up, because of all of us, me, Len, a couple of artists, John Romita, who designed the costume, and Herb Trimpe, who was the original artist, and then other people who took it over later and developed it, it gradually became, one of the 3 or 4 best known and greatest characters. But he was originally just a throwaway idea to get some Canadian readers.
Now, we all know who Stan Lee is, but there were many people involved in creating the Marvel Universe. What can you say about Jack Kirby, Roy?
Yeah, it's... I get caught in the middle sometime because there are people that think that Stan Lee was the only person important to Marvel and other people that think that Jack Kirby was the only person important to Marvel. And, of course, they were both very important to Marvel. But Jack Kirby, I didn't know who he was, but he had been part of a team that signed themselves Simon and Kirby, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. And Jack was the one that did most of the actual drawing in that team. And I was a fan of theirs since when I was 5 or 6 years old and discovered some of their stories. There was just an excitement and dynamism about Jack's work that came alive. And Stan had gotten lucky back in the late 50s because Jack, I don't know if you know this, but Jack had been working for DC Comics for years, the main competitor, and a much larger company then than Marvel was. But unfortunately, he got into a dispute with an editor there, and Jack suddenly found himself blackballed at DC. So Jack had to wander over to what was not even called Marvel Comics at that time. And he was just there at the right time. And about a year or so later, when Stan decided it was time to get back in the superhero business and see how that worked out, they just happened to be lucky that they had probably as good a superhero artist as ever existed in the world right there on their doorstep because DC had thrown him out. So DC basically, slit its own throat by firing Jack Kirby back in the 50s.
What can you add, Tom?
Well, there's probably not enough, tape or bytes to contain the whole of what could be said about Jack Kirby. Certainly, foremost as one of the best illustrators comics ever had. But the place where I think he's undervalued is as a storyteller, a storyman, and an idea generator. The division of labor was not always as cut and dried as one guy, writes the stuff and therefore is coming up with all of the ideas, and the other guy draws them, particularly in the way that Marvel Comics of the period tended to be done, which was very different and put a lot more of the onus on the artist as not just storyteller, but as writer, as creator. Most of the Marvel stories would start out with a conversation where, and for the sake of this example, I'll say Stan and Jack would get together. They would either get together in person or on the phone to talk about whatever the next issue of whatever book they happened to be working on was.
Right.
So if it was an issue of Thor, they would get on the phone together, and one or the other of them would start with some idea. And as often as not, that would be Kirby. And sometimes that would be Stan. And they'd say, okay, we're going to have Loki do this. And they would bounce around back and forth. Here's what Loki's got going on. And here's what we want to do with Jane Foster. And maybe we should do this with Balder. And at the end of that phone call, Kirby would go away back to his studio, and he would draw the entire story. And Stan would dialogue the story. He would write the actual copy that would go on the boards, all of the captions, all of the word balloons and thought balloons and sound effects. As a result, there's a real improvisational sensibility to a lot of these early books, because it is two guys that are almost playing jazz with one another.
Jack Kirby was a fount of endless invention. He never stopped inventing. What he saw that triggered his "that is great" response, he would then mold into his own work. So he combined the real world and the imagination that he clearly possessed that was nonstop throughout his entire career. That's what he had going for him in terms of the reason he became so successful, so respected, was that he was himself so wonderful and so supportive and so creative.
The triangle, really, that made the Marvel Universe was Stan Lee as the overseer, editor, co-plotter. Then you have the visual engineers, the visual artists, and also co-plotters of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, who brought totally different ends of a spectrum together under this feeling of continuity and shared universe that Stan Lee made sure everything kind of fit well with each other. So Jack Kirby came from 20 years of action superhero already. So by the time he got to Marvel in 1959, he had a lot of storytelling, a lot of action under his belt. And I would say that Stan Lee, he was one of the few editors under a publisher that they valued Jack Kirby's contributions. They let Jack create as long as everything fit within the plots. Sometimes he'd go beyond the plots and create even new things, but Stan Lee was fine with that. And he brought power, action, dynamism, and that really meshed well with Stan Lee's dialogue balloons, his wording.
And what about Steve Ditko? Roy Thomas?
Well, he was always a mystery man to them, to me, to just about everybody. It's not exactly that he was a recluse, but he was a very private guy, and he had very strong beliefs in various areas. And he and Stan were, it seemed, opposite wavelengths, and yet for several years they got along wonderfully. Basically, he was just a wonderful artist in terms of telling a story and so forth.
Wonderful, idiosyncratic.
This is Maggie Thompson again.
He was so generous to the fans. I'm going to tear up a little bit here. Ditko's art was very distinctive, and he tended to draw non-superhero characters almost stiffly. The hair was kind of like helmet hair on the girls. They seemed almost rigid. And what he did with Spider-Man was he drew a counterpoint to his own style. So here are these relatively stiff characters representing daily life that the reader, for example, is experiencing. But swinging through that with vitality and curves is Spider-Man, swinging out.
Spider-Man was one of the first things Steve Ditko worked on. Stan Lee had the idea of this character, but he didn't go to Ditko first. Here's Roy Thomas again telling us what happened.
Jack just couldn't get quite what Stan wanted. Jack was just the greatest superhero artist in the world. But what Stan wanted for this guy was something different. He wanted a kind of a teenager, even a little gawky teenager. And somehow Jack kept drawing the guy to look too handsome and too heroic. He didn't look like some gawky 16, 17-year-old high school kid. So finally, after a few pages got done, Stan evidently said to him, says, well, Jack, you got Thor and the Hulk and Fantastic Four to do and this and that. I'll just try somebody else on Spider-Man. So he brought in Steve Ditko. They hashed it around, changed the idea evidently quite a bit from what it had been. Steve designed a truly wonderful costume, one of the best ever designed. And the next thing you know, they had this wonderful character, which lasted exactly one issue because the publisher didn't like the idea of a Spider-Man, and he canceled the magazine. He told Stan, this character's no good. People don't like spiders, so they're not going to buy it. You got a kid as the hero, and kids can't be heroes. They can only be sidekicks. And you're giving him these personal problems. People don't want to read about personal problems of superheroes. So for all these reasons, he said that Spider-Man was just like one of the worst ideas. Stan says that as soon as the sales figures came in on that single issue they had put out, the publisher came in and said, hey, you remember that character we liked so much? That's Spider-Man. He sold pretty well. Let's do a whole book about him. And then they were off and running. But Stan never forgot, that the publisher had really hated that idea.
Maggie and her husband, Don, liked Ditko's work so much that they sent a letter to Stan Lee praising it.
And Stan passed our letter on to Steve Ditko, and Steve Ditko did a drawing for us that is framed on my wall, which is the Vulture and Dr. Octopus with Spider-Man swinging through them. And it's, as I say, it is framed on my wall. And he just did that in response to a, gosh, we like his art letter. So Steve was that kind of guy. He also was highly dedicated to his own point of view, which caused some problems with some circumstances. But by golly, when you care that much about what you do, that's an asset in itself. And the fact that there was eventual division just because Steve Ditko cared so much about what he had done, it as you can see, I'm at a loss for words.
So let's turn to Tom Brevoort, the current editor at Marvel.
Steve Ditko, a formative creative force. Yeah, Steve didn't do as many strips and wasn't as connected to as many characters as Jack was, but every character he touched, he changed and left his mark on, and that includes characters that were not originated by him. I'm thinking specifically of characters like Iron Man. Steve only did, I think, 3 Iron Man stories in the 60s. But during his 3 Iron Man stories, he redesigned the character with Stan's approval and blessing and encouragement, turning him from the original Jack Kirby design, which was sort of this big, almost stovepipe-looking guy, into this much sleeker red and gold Iron Man design, which is very much the design that is still used today, even though it's evolved and gone through a number of changes over the years.
Wow.
And that's not a small thing.
No, that is definitely not a small thing. And that brings us to the next big topic in this soundtrack, Iron Man and his many different armors. First, let's hear from Roy Thomas. Iron Man was already a character in the Marvel Universe when you joined in 65, and you obviously worked on him. What can you say about this character?
I would have considered him like just a so-so creation back then. He was one of the last of the first round of superheroes Stan made up. He was before Daredevil, but he was after most of the rest of them, like Thor and Spider-Man and Ant-Man and Fantastic Four and the Hulk. But it was just an interesting idea, of a guy who has to wear this big, bulky armor, as he did at first, in order to be able to move at all, because he's in danger of dying, and he has to, I don't know, there's some kind of science fictional gobbledygook about something in that armor that keeps the shrapnel that he's ingested from getting to his heart and killing him. I could never make any sense out of that. But the idea of a guy who puts on this armor to become a superhero was kind of interesting. And then about a year later, they kind of streamlined the armor so he didn't look quite as clunky. And he became, not one of Marvel's great characters, but he supported his own magazine for a number of years. And I didn't write his own book very often, but I loved having him he was one of the original Avengers, and I liked having him around the Avengers. Because one of the interesting things was that, he's this very fragile guy in a certain way, but he's also like one of the richest guys in the world, a great inventor and so forth. And yet, he also has this kind of physical life. But he seemed like a character that was not going to ever be one of Marvel's major characters. And then, of course, along came the movies,
Yeah.
It's amazing because some of the characters that worked out better in movies didn't work out quite as well in comic books and vice versa. The Fantastic Four, somehow, they never found quite the right movie. And although those movies were okay, they didn't establish the primacy in the movies that the Fantastic Four had in the comic as always one of the better-selling Marvel books, and yet some quite less important character like Iron Man would suddenly become, the sort of the linchpin of the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe, which was a combination of the fact that he just happened to be around and some rather brilliant casting that somebody had by getting Robert Downey Jr. in there and having somebody write just the right kind of dialogue and that he could play and so forth. And next thing you know, Iron Man became one of Marvel's most popular characters. And a couple of years before that, nobody would have ever believed it.
Tom Brevoort, what can you say about Iron Man?
He's a cool exec with a heart of steel. What else? What else is there? Iron Man has kind of become the face of modern Marvel because he was the first character that Marvel Studios put forth in a solo movie, and he was the first success to happen there. And all of the other film successes that came after that kind of grew out of that initial piece and out of Robert Downey's performance as Iron Man. Consequently, Iron Man is way better known and way more popular today than he was even in the comic field and internally in 2007. And that's one of the wonderful things about the Marvel characters. There have been things that haven't worked in their time or haven't caught on at a given moment that have become hugely successful when the moment has changed and the time has been right. This sort of trajectory that happens with the Marvel characters all the time. And the most unlikely pieces of the Marvel Universe, the most unlikely characters can suddenly find their moment and become hugely embraced. You never know, and all of it, even the failures, are successes.
Yeah, exactly. You never know. Maggie Thompson, what are your thoughts?
Well, he built in a weakness for Iron Man. And it was interesting to see the story evolve, because that first outfit that Iron Man had looked like a hot water tank. And it was amusing that in the movie they actually addressed that. Fans went, "Yay, that's the original costume. That is so silly looking." And then the realization that you have to make that evolve so that it will appeal all the way around, but you still have to build in that weakness. What is his weakness? Wait a minute. Why is this thing on his chest? Oh, wait, he almost died. So how do we have a vulnerable hero who has worked out how to protect himself and then goes on to protect others as well? What other challenges will he be met with? And it doesn't hurt that by the time you get a movie out there, you've got a fantastic actor putting it across to an audience. And again, with that wonderful vulnerability of the character. If the character's invulnerable, who's going to care? Mm-hmm. Oh, he's not going to die. He's not going to get hurt. He's going to be just fine. He probably has all the friends he ever needs, etc. Well, you go, well, maybe it's not that simple. Maybe it's not that simple. And Iron Man was by no means the first use of the concept of, hey, you could have this armored character who could go out there and do things. But what he did was build in your vulnerable, brilliant hero and use that device to make fascinating stories.
It's interesting. He started out as kind of an anti-communist, like commentary on the Vietnam War, but it grew into something more than that, where they actually kept him out of wars after a while. And he became more of an inventor, trying to figure out what armor will fit this current situation. Like Jack Kirby's first suit was so much fun. It was just this kind of primitive gray metallic suit he made while he was in captivity.
Yeah, he started off having to make this big clunky armor. It was like, it would have made him an extra foot or so taller. It was just huge. He looked like a robot, really.
That was a Jack Kirby design. Then you have the yellow golden suit that was showcased in the early Avengers comics. Then you have Steve Ditko's redesign of it, where you have the red and yellow, and that's still being used in the movies and things. My favorite one is the Silver Centurion from the 80s. I like the 80s shoulder pads, and those are fun to look at. But also, it's just sleek, clean. It looks really like this 80s contemporary modern look. Barry Windsor Smith did a great rendition of that in 1988. And then the suits developed through time, right? You have the nanotech stuff that's more recent, where little particles of metal come together, again, like Lego pieces, to assemble his outfit. Yeah, I think the tech and the fascination with technology is something that I find really appealing about Iron Man.
Yeah, Alex, can you deep dive on that a little bit more? How the armors were affected by technology and trends in different decades? You mentioned the shoulder pads. What other elements do we see of that?
Yeah, exactly. So I think in the 60s, there's a love of science fiction anyway. So there was still an echo of the 50s sci-fi element in his first outfit that Jack Kirby came up with. Then I think as the 60s are kind of rolling along, we like colors, right? So the 60s are all about color. If you look at psychedelic posters, color matters in the 60s. And so I think initially the colorists then made it more of a golden yellow color. Still the clunky outfit, though. Now, Steve Ditko, like when he designed the Spider-Man costume, and he designed the use of Doctor Strange and the look of Doctor Strange and his powers, and even plotted a lot of the stories, when he redesigned the Iron Man costume, he made it so that it was like putting on gloves and a helmet, and they were red, but then the yellow pant legs and sleeves would kind of slide up the arm and take up the rest of the space to assemble the costume. And that's when the concept of this armor that's mobilizing to fit the wearer starts to come into play. That was Steve Ditko's contribution to that. And that's, again, part of the, if you look at a lot of 60s advertising, it's all about sleek. Like, let's make it sleek. And then I think just as the 70s goes on, it's probably less about technology in the 70s. Things got a little darker in the 70s, but one of the funny additions was they added a nose on Iron Man, which almost makes no sense, but they added a pointy triangle there. Then I think in the 80s, it's a little more exciting. I think it's a different era in the 80s. If you look at like music videos, there's more of an interest in tech, in 80s tech. You look at the funny experimental MTV videos and you think, wow, it looks so goofy then, but they were actually having fun just with technology. And that's when you have like different outfits, like the underwater Iron Man costume, which was like the whole thing was just really dark blue, just to kind of camouflage undersea. You have the Silver Centurion, where it was like this clean silver white look, and then of course you have 80s shoulder pads. In the 90s, it got a little different because you have a lot of action movies coming out in the 90s. It was all about extreme action. I don't want to say all about. There's also independent films and independent comics that weren't. But I think the mainstream interest and what got fans to the comics and what got moviegoers to the movies was big explosive action. So you see the Iron Man costume taken on almost extreme proportions, where you have War Machine, which is like full of machine guns and missile launchers, right? It's like this kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger version of Commando, but in an Iron Man costume. Then you have in the 2000s, Extremis, where you have almost like a biotech version where it's part of his brain chemistry, the adaptation of the suit. It's almost like part mutation. And then I think more of the modern times is nanotechnology and how you can get nanotech receptors and remote control with things that are smaller than a human cell, right? And then that becomes manifest in the new Iron Man suits, which were in the movies, where they would come like a horde of insects, but it was actually nanotech-driven pieces of his armor suit.
Well, I suspect that you have a bunch of designers, whether they're comic book artists or whether we're in the movies and we're actually having to animate the action. The designer saying, here's what works and here's what doesn't work. So there was a question at one point, as I recall, like, did Iron Man have a nose? Could you see his nose under the helmet? This was back in comic book days. One of the challenges with Iron Man is determining the emotion of the character behind an expressionless visor. And that's challenging. And yet you can tell that story, but you need to see that there's that guy underneath. So we suddenly go from this faceplate, which is just a piece of pot on his head, to having a visor that will raise so that, we can see his face. We can see the way he looks if he wants us to. And then the concept of what does he see in that costume? In movies, they face the challenge and it got more complicated in a way, but easier in a way to understand what's going on because you see underneath the visor a lot of the time and you can see his face reflected into it. So you have different artists solving different problems of storytelling to make it more and more and more interesting. And then you end up with a Halloween costume that a kid can wear and get a candy bar for.
Yeah. Did you have a favorite?
I almost would say my heart belongs to the water tank, but it doesn't. Oh, goodness. No. They're each one solves its own problems. And then as it evolves, I don't think anything is lost from generation to generation of that costume. I think each is intriguing. I don't look at the current costume and go, I wish he was a water tank.
Yeah.
They've come a long way, let's put it that way.
Yeah, in the original days, I remember there was a lot of talk about transistors. Nobody who knows about transistors anymore, but for a while, he was called the transistorized Titan, and then the transistors were a big deal. Then it became, I don't know, different things. I don't know what he runs on now. Maybe solar batteries or wind power. I don't know. Then he'd have to paint himself green, right?
Yeah, he's somehow part of a Tesla.
Yeah. Iron Man was always an evolving look. Sometimes the armor would get a little bigger and bulkier. It would suddenly have, I don't know, things jutting off it and so forth. And it would be red and yellow was a good color. For a while, it became red and white. That didn't look too good. it was every few years when they'd want to juice the sales up a little bit, they'd have something new happen with Iron Man's armor and he'd get a little different look. But it was always a minor cosmetic thing. I think about the only thing they ever really did really big with him was, when they turned him into an alcoholic,
What about you, Tom?
I think my favorite, unfortunately, is it's kind of a boring answer. I like the classic red and gold armor that Iron Man wore from the mid '60s into the mid '80s. That's another good example that of kind of the evolution of a Marvel character. Stan and Jack Kirby and Don Heck launched Iron Man, and he did all right, but the strip wasn't quite catching on to the degree that other Marvel properties did, and they completely head to toe redesigned the character. Like they threw the old design out and gave him a new suit, and that became part and parcel of what the character was about, creating this identity for himself and this superhumanity, out of his own intellect, and then that became a larger idea that, okay, well, if you can create, and upgrade and improve the suit that you're in, maybe you could also create suits for specific purposes. And so you would roll out the space armor that Iron Man would use when he had to go on a deep space mission, or the undersea armor when he had to go to the bottom of the ocean floor, or the stealth armor when he had to sneak into some, hostile area. And each one of those changed the parameters of the character a little bit, gave it a momentary visual refresh and made it interesting, added color to the character, and expanded on the idea of what Iron Man could be. To the point now where, we've done a zillion different iterations of Iron Man armor, and the character is constantly rolling out and developing new looks and new technologies, new weapons, new defenses, new gadgets.
Now, Roy, Alex and Maggie mentioned it briefly before. There was a short run where Iron Man's mask had a nose in the comic books.
Yeah.
It was in '63 before you were there. Can you tell us more about how the nose came about?
Well, I've just heard this. Evidently, Stan, of course, had been overseeing that character since the very beginning. He had written it for years, and he was still the editor and the publisher. And all of a sudden, one day, he evidently said to a couple of his editors, he suddenly looked at the mask and said, I guess it just looked like you couldn't really fit a nose or something under that, armor with that, so he said, shouldn't he have a nose? Well, they took that literally, so then they designed a nose for him. And then when Stan saw this, he says, well, that doesn't look good. Get rid of that nose. The thing is, Stan was always doing these things by the seat of his pants, and he just kind of threw out ideas. Sometimes you had to take him seriously, sometimes you didn't. In this case, I don't know if he meant it when he said it or not, but it was just one of those things that didn't work out.
Coming up, we're going to hear back from all 4 of our Marvel experts about their meetings with the man himself, Stan Lee. In fact, it turns out Roy Thomas was one of the last people to see him before he passed away in 2018. But now let's bring in LEGO Art's senior designer Kitt Kossmann and design lead Christopher Stamp and talk about how Iron Man was recreated in LEGO Art. What's it like working at the LEGO Group? What's the day-to-day like? Is it as LEGO-like as people would hope to imagine?
It's really a fun place to work because there are so many nationalities and there are so many people. In some way, it's like being in school still, like when I was going to the art school, because there's so many people that are interested in the same topic. And if you have any issues with things that you can't really figure out how to do, or you just need to talk to somebody about what you've done and hear their reflections on it, you can always find somebody. And I think everybody has time for you, which is also really nice. So I think the atmosphere is really good.
Yeah, I think the same as Kitt. It doesn't feel like a job sometimes because it's quite fun. And I mean, you spend a lot of your days discussing, if it's a Star Wars model, you're discussing the lasers on the side of a Star Wars vehicle and you're developing elements that can shoot bullets and stuff. So it's like discussing which one can go farther. So it's not exactly what you would call a normal job. Every time we're doing a product, every little detail, you really go into it and you talk for hours over the smallest of details, from colors to element choices to everything. And just that level of passion and attention to detail. That's really, I don't think you get that a lot of places. So it kind of feels a bit old fashioned, which is great because you can tell there's definitely a passion there and an interest in what the work that people's doing.
Yeah, it sounds like every detail is something that's up for great discussion and debate, and everyone's learning from each other. It sounds like a really creative environment, and it probably really brings out the inner child in a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, I feel like Chris, like going to work is fun. It's like play a lot of the times, and sometimes, people also say to you, like, how can you get money for just playing with bricks? That's amazing. Is that your job?
Yeah, exactly.
So just going to work is like, I have to build today. Yay! So that's nice. That's really nice.
What are your relationships with Marvel Universe? Did you grow up reading the comic books, or how is this exciting working with Marvel for you?
Oh, I've always been very fascinated by superheroes. I think it's a fascinating universe, and it's just like fascinating that these people have all these skills. Like as a child, of course, you dreamed of like being able to do something like that. My personal superhero is not particularly Iron Man. I like Iron Man, but I like Spider-Man better. And I think that has to do with the universe he's in and his character, because he's like funny, but he also makes mistakes. And I always found that he was very amusing.
What about you, Christopher?
I was actually super excited, to be honest. I have to admit, I don't very often geek out, but with this product, I definitely did. As a child, as a 90s kid, I was a huge fan of the cartoons rather than the comics. So I was really into the 90s Spider-Man animated TV show and the 90s X-Men animated TV shows on Fox. I thought those were fantastic. And then over the last 10 years, I'm a huge fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I've actually, last week I watched all of them again, but I really love those movies. Big fan of Ryan and his team who do all of the concept art for the movies, and I'm just a big Marvel Cinematic geek. So for me, this was a dream project.
No kidding. What was the kid in you saying when you found out you got to do this?
To be honest, the first thing I was like, am I going to meet Iron Man? I think, that's kind of the first, like, oh, we have to go and visit Marvel. Oh no, that would be like a great opportunity. We didn't have to, obviously, because we're very digital on this project. But that was always on the back of my mind.
That's so good. What can you say about Iron Man?
I was actually very surprised that he had so many outfits. Like that, we started out like with the Mark III and then went on to a Mark 85 and the Hulkbuster as well. He has so many outfits, and I must say, even though I'm an Iron Man fan, I also must say that I might be a bit of an Iron Man ignorant, since I didn't know that he had all these outfits. But I really learned a lot doing this, and Chris taught me the differences between the different outfits that I had to pay like a lot of attention to the Mark 85 that had gold like shoulders, as an example.
Yeah, let's actually get into those. If you have the set, you can choose to make one of 3 different pictures of Iron Man. Tell us about the Mark III armor.
So we looked at the catalog of the different suits. We talked a lot about which ones were the right ones to do and why. I know that for a long time I was discussing the Mark I, which is the one he uses to break out of the cave. The challenge with that is obviously the color palette doesn't match, so that would just cause some practicality issues. The reason that we went for the Mark I is because, well, first of all, we focused on the movie designs rather than the comic books, because with the movies, that's what the current generation of adults and kids really know the character for. You're talking about more the die-hard fans who know the comic books. So we specifically went for the movie direction to be more with the now and the present and work with what people currently think of when they see Iron Man. The reason that we picked the Mark III first was because that is what you see in that 10 years ago, that original Iron Man movie. this is kind of the first true Iron Man costume when he's really went back to his workshop. He's corrected all of the functions and features, and he's starting to become the true Iron Man as we begin to know him. So for us, because that was his first real outing in the red and gold color palette, we felt that was the one we had to do. No matter what the other images became, that was one that we definitely wanted on our wish list.
And what about the Hulkbuster Mark I?
So with the Hulkbuster, we were looking for differentiation throughout the different designs. And the Hulkbuster, first of all, it's a fan favorite. Just going into the story about it and the connection with the Hulk, it's a huge deal in the comics, and it plays a huge part in Age of Ultron. We tried to pick costumes from different movies throughout the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and also designs that were distinctively different. And when you think about it, the Hulkbuster comes straight to your mind. Personally, it's one of my favorite Iron Man suits. So it was something that straight away I was like, okay, different shape helmet, different body shape. This is one that I don't know how we're going to achieve it, but this is something we need to just explore, because it will give us definitely a different silhouette and shape on the box. The faceplate is different. Everything about it looks different. Because of the color palette, it's also the same. So it was different enough, but it wasn't too different that you think it's a completely different character. So that's kind of what lent us towards the Hulkbuster. When you're looking at the different versions of the Hulkbuster, you have to, like with the Mark III, you have to go for the original. There is a few different versions out there, but you have to go for the original. That's the big one.
And then the Mark 85 armor. What can you tell us about that?
So the Mark 85, so this one kind of, we talked a lot directly with Marvel about, because obviously, spoilers for in Endgame, in Infinity War and in Endgame, that's Iron Man's final movies. And we discussed a lot about what do people think about and how do they remember Iron Man as a character. And this is the suit he wears in those movies. And this is the nanotech suit. So the reason that we picked this one was because it felt like this, if you use the three images to tell a story of Iron Man's journey, these three kind of take screenshots of that full journey, starting with his first suit, going through his battles with the team and the Avengers with the Hulkbuster, to this being his final suit. So we felt that as a character arc for the character, this selection of suits made sense as a trio.
And I guess you had photos to work with when you started the design. Mm-hmm. Tell us a bit about that process.
I think the biggest challenge that I found with doing these ones was that we had to create this feel of gold in the faces of them without actually using gold. So that was definitely a challenge to get that right, because there is like Lego gold in there, but that Lego gold is not really shiny. So we had to create both shape and also the feel that this is shiny and golden by using different shades of brown. And the same actually went for the red when we did the body of the Iron Man. And the thing was also we needed to make it feel like a suit. So we needed to create these big shapes and chunks of a color to kind of get the feeling that this is one big metal part that is made in the color red, but still add the shape to it.
Absolutely. We tried to, when we first started looking into this, we tried to simplify it, and it looked like a comic book version, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because that is the medium in this case. But because we'd specifically made that choice to focus on the movies and focus on more of a photorealistic aesthetic, it was kind of a double task, because not only were we trying to capture the highlights in terms of the shadows and highlights to make it look 3D, but then on top of that, trying to make it look like reflective metal. Then we started really looking at this product the way an artist would, with a paintbrush and a set of colors, because you were really trying to, then you start looking into shading and, okay, there's a highlight here, so that's going to affect that highlight, but that highlight on the top of the helmet needs to be brighter than the highlight on the front of the helmet. So you then get into long conversations about highlights. in when you look at Iron Man normally, the strange thing about this is you don't focus on the highlights. You focus on the complete picture. But if we remove those highlights from the picture we're creating, all of a sudden it's not Iron Man, or it's not the Iron Man that you recognize. So it's something that most people don't think about, but if you remove it, you'll notice that something's wrong.
Yeah, and the first Iron Man mosaic you worked on was the Hulkbuster, and in the beginning you were using square tiles to build the model. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah. We did that in the very beginning. And what we found out was actually we first did it in squares, and then I think we did a version of the same one with round plates instead on black plates. And what we found out was just that the picture gets so much deeper by using like round plates where you can like see the black plates a bit. It's kind of like the color merges in your head in a better way when we do it with round plates on the black background.
Yeah, Kitt's exactly right. When we were looking at it, this is one that we physically made. A lot of this project was digital, but this was a product where we made it physically with the square plates and then the round plates. Because with the square plates, we kept looking at it, and yes, it's a mosaic, but it looked pixelated. It looked very angular. And for a suit that's quite organic, when you think about it, the edges, they just weren't soft enough. There was a lot of corners in places that they shouldn't be corners. And then as soon as we changed to the more round look, then all of a sudden, all of those kind of sharp edges were removed and it disappeared and it became a much more softer shape. And therefore, the overall aesthetic became a lot more organic and a lot cleaner. And it just, I don't know, it kind of made it feel a lot more real all of a sudden. It made it feel like it was popping more out of the picture rather than looking flat against the background.
Mm.
It's normal that Lego fans are creating something new, and now that these brand new Lego art tiles are out there, do you expect that fans are going to start creating their own pieces? And if so, are you looking forward to that, to see what they'll come up with?
Oh, I really hope that they'll do that. That could be very inspiring, also for us to see.
Yeah, I completely agree with Kitt. We've got such a fantastic adult community, and if you go on the internet, you can see they make these fantastic creations. Their imagination is just off the charts. I think the good thing about this, what I'm most excited about, is you don't need to stick to the 48 by 48 scale.
Yeah, the frame.
Yeah, the frame. So what you can do is this is sliced up into 9 sections, and you can make it bigger, you can make it smaller, it's a building system. You can build on it and make it a bigger image if you wish. So I think that's what I'm really excited about is, yeah, there'll be people who make images of their favorite characters or themselves and things, and I think that alone is fantastic. But I'm really excited to see what stuff are we not thinking they're going to do that they surprise us by doing. Are they going to make a picture that's, I don't know, 3,000 by 3,000 and it's huge from the floor to the ceiling? Or are they going to make something that's really short but really long? Or I'm just excited to see what new things they come up with.
Wow, that's so neat. It's like it could be the final product, or it could be just the beginning for some Lego fans. It's so interesting. Thanks so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Before we wrap up, let's bring back our 4 Marvel experts, Alex, Maggie, Tom, and Roy, and hear about their encounters with the biggest hero of them all, Stan Lee. Maggie Thompson, I heard that you wrote Stan a letter when you were fairly young. What can you tell us about that?
I wasn't very young when I wrote Stan. I am embarrassed to say I was probably 19 or 20, so not very young. And when my daughter was helping me clean my attic last year, she found a very embarrassing letter because I had kept the communication. I kept my carbons. And what I was doing was complaining to Stan that in the Thor comic book, that obviously he was missing a bet because he didn't understand that Loki was not Thor's brother, that Loki was one of the elder gods basically on a par with Odin, blah, 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 for 6 pages. And my daughter found this letter, as I say, filled with self-importance. And Stan's response boiled down to, it's wonderful that Marvel has created something that builds such fans that they would go into such details about what they're reading. Please feel free to write to me again, and I'll be glad to answer any question you have as long as it can be answered with yes or no. And Stan has always, always, always been kind and responsive. My brother worked for Marvel in the 1990s, and I was talking to him the other day, and he always felt that a major goal for Stan Lee was to make reading seem cool to kids. Remember that there was a time when reading novels was considered to be spending time on trash. Well, after World War II, it was reading comics that was considered to be spending time on trash. And Stan worked for many years to make it clear comic books aren't trash, and reading for pleasure is beneficial. And Stan said it better than I've just expressed it, and he was completely successful in making reading seem cool.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever meet him?
Oh, many times, yes.
Tell us a bit about that.
Well, he was just always wonderful. He had a famously bad memory. So among the impressive things about Stan Lee was his being able to produce as much work as he produced, and it was work, dealing with a bad memory. Can you imagine keeping all the special attributes of all the characters and all the characters' names straight and telling a story with this artist and that artist and the other artist while he was churning out volumes of material, which, as I say, sometimes meant that he didn't remember a particular person. So I was at a breakfast meeting with him at a convention, and we went through the whole meal, and I think the check came or something. Anyway, Carol turned to me and she said, well, Maggie, and Stan did a double take. And as I say, I'd known him for years. And he said, Maggie, oh, I thought you were Carol's secretary. I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was you. So he was wonderful and affable and sweet and articulate to people that he thought he was meeting for the first time. I did an essay at one point saying that if you think of someone who represents editors to the world at large, it was Stan. You would recognize him in an elevator. He was the editor. There were other editors who were more influential, maybe, but by golly, Stan was the guy who was the image of the editor to a generation that grew up with his work.
Alex Grand, you also met Stan?
Yeah, I met him once at WonderCon, and I had a black Spider-Man suit on. This is, I think, before I got more public about my comic book historian stuff, but he liked the black Spider-Man costume, and we took a picture together. He was kind of in a rush with a lot of the other ones, but with me, he was really nice. I think he just kind of liked my vibe, and I asked him a few questions, and he was just really nice. He shook my hand, and really, really nice fella. I could tell he was kind of stressed from the lines because he's like 95 at this point. Mm-hmm. Maybe even 90. Maybe he was 93. But it was just nice that I think when it comes to social cues, Stan is a master. He was a master of that in the 60s, 70s, even in the 90s. Such a dynamo. I think that the world is missing something with him gone. That's for sure. But I think so many people love what he did that keeps the magic going.
Where do you have that picture?
It's actually in my wall. I don't show it to too many people because I'm in that black costume, but I love it. It's framed.
Of course. So what about you, Tom? You've been with Marvel Comics for 30 years, so you must have worked with Stan.
I've worked with Stan a number of times over the years since I was at Marvel. Enough so that, while I would in no way consider myself a close friend of Stan's or anything, but he certainly knew who I was. Stan was very much, the person that you see on TV or in films, and hear in the various interviews, he did. There's certainly a dial on it. He would dial it, the experience up or dial it down, but that wasn't really a put on. He legitimately was that excited and excitable and energetic and enthusiastic about what he was doing. And he would legitimately talk and write the way he sounds in all of those clips that you've seen from over the years, at least to my experience going back to 89.
Right.
I worked with Stan in the early 2000s on a book that was called The Last Fantastic Four Story. And the premise of the project was exactly what it says. We went to Stan and we paired him up with John Romita Jr., one of the preeminent artists of the Marvel stable for years and years. And, we basically said, Stan, we want you to just write whatever it means, whatever the last Fantastic Four story would be for you, write that, and we'll do that as a special. And Stan went away, and he wrote up his outline and sent it in to me. And we looked at it, and we generally liked it, but we had a couple of notes, a couple of thoughts, and I sent Stan back those notes and things. And we came in the next day, and there was a message from Stan on my office voicemail. And the message was Stan going, well, I don't know, Tom, you've got these notes, and I don't know if I can do it this other way that you want. And if you want it to be different than what I want to do, maybe I shouldn't be doing it. And, and this was sort of a traumatic moment for us because we had made Stan, sad and upset.
Yeah.
Marvel's offices are on the East Coast, and Stan lives on the West Coast, or, lived on the West Coast. And so it was going to be 3 or 4 hours before I could even call him back and tell him, hey, you don't have to worry, Stan. If you're committed to doing X, Y, and Z the way you want to do it, that's fine, and so forth. So we had 3 hours or so to walk around and fret about this and to feel bad or whatever. And so, it finally got to be 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, late enough that you could call the West Coast. And so I called Stan up, and before I could even really get into the conversation, Stan said to me, hey, Tom, I want to apologize to you about the message I left you yesterday. I'd spent the whole day revising a whole bunch of other things, and I got your email at the end of the day, and it was the last thing I wanted to do was revise anything else. I was so burnt out and exhausted, but I've looked at all the notes and the feedback you had, and it's all great and it's good by me. I'm going to take care of it all right now, and so you don't have to worry about that. I'm sorry for leaving you the message, and that was it. And he went and did all that stuff, and then went off, and we finished the book and put the book together.
As we all know, Stan Lee passed away a few years ago. And Roy Thomas, you were one of the last people to see him when you flew across the country to visit him 48 hours before he passed away. Could you tell us a bit about that experience?
Yeah, it was actually even less than that. But what happened is that earlier I had broached the subject to the person who was, sort of handling his affairs with him and so forth at the time, about 6 months or so earlier, about the idea of coming out there. And he said, fine, but then he left and nothing ever happened of it. And finally one day, I have a manager who handles my convention appearances and signings and different things, John Cimino, who's been a dealer and worked in conventions for many years. And we were talking, he just decided that, he should make that happen. So he got on the phone with some people he knew, and it turns out he was able to reach the guy who was then sort of, working with Stan, staying there in the house with him during the day. And it turned out it was somebody he even knew slightly, a very nice guy. And so we arranged for me to fly out there from the East Coast. We knew that, at the most we were going to be able to spend about a half an hour with him before Stan would probably, be tired because, he didn't have much energy, left. Had come close to death once or twice before. But I figured, I'll fly across the country and take a chance of spending a half an hour talking to this person who has meant, so much to me, and I mean a little something to him, and might cheer him up and it would cheer me up and so forth. And so we took a chance and it worked out, and we had a nice little visit for that half hour. It's not that I necessarily thought he was going to pass away in a couple of days. I wouldn't have been surprised if he had passed away months earlier. I wouldn't have been surprised if he had lasted another year or two. It's hard to tell. But he didn't have much energy. And we saw him, on an afternoon, and he passed away on a morning must have been, 35 or 40 hours later, I guess, actually. And I was very glad we saw him, and I think it cheered Stan up a little bit too, so I think it was a good situation. But I was sorry that our final meeting, of course, had to be under that kind of circumstance. But we just, kidded around and didn't talk about anything that serious, and then it was over.
Thank you for listening to the story behind Marvel Comics and Iron Man. How's your piece of art coming along? Are you getting ready to hang it on the wall? Maybe you're ready to break it apart and build one of the other versions, or create your own. My name's Andrea Collins, and this has been an original soundtrack from Lego Art.